Great, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say welcome to everyone for coming here today. I'm very happy to see you. Oops. Sorry, I have suddenly clicked on the wrong link and almost shut the whole thing down. All right, my name is Morgan Dunton. I'm sure you know that because you've been hearing from me a whole lot. I'm thrilled to see you here today. We're going to talk about poetry and a whole lot of other things in this thing I'm calling Normalized Poetry. You should have gotten a homework assignment, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. The idea here is we want to use poetry in every ELA unit of instruction. There's really good reasons to do that, and that's why I'm calling it Normalized Poetry. It might help if you have something to write on, something to write with, if you don't have that right at your fingertips. But with that said, we'll get going and we can pause for a moment if you need to grab something. So the first thing that I would like to do is to have a discussion, and this is where I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself and talk about the poem that you created using the sentences that I sent to you. How did you determine a verse form? How did you decide where to break the lines? And what is the overall effect of seeing those particular sentences written in a verse form rather than in a prose form? Okay, so I'm going to invite you to jump in and tell us a little bit about that process of taking the prose I sent you and writing it as a poem. How did you make the decisions about writing it in verse form?
Morgan, do you want us to raise our virtual hands, our real hands? How do you want to, how would you like us to do this? Because I don't mind going first, but I wasn't sure if someone else had already offered.
No one had, so why don't we raise real hands, because I can
okay,
see all
I can't, okay. Hi, my name is Peg Atchison. I teach in Brunswick. And I dutifully, what I did was I printed it out and I did a single slash for a line break, double slash for a stanza break. And of course, like any good student, I didn't read it first. You know, I kind of looked at it and I started doing the thing. And I did exactly what my kids do. And I was noticing all these wonderful details in the beginning. So when I realized the surprise, the turn at the end, I went back and really wanted to string out and take a long time with those details. I put a stanza break in your last line between her and dead. And I won't tell you what all the other decisions I made were, but I see it as being a poem that takes a long time with the details. Some of the details are, you know, the white cotton gloves and pulling them up. So I had a lot of short lines there. I had a break after settled. I had a break after removing.
So you made lots of short lines to really emphasize the separate images that were in there.
Right. Yeah. And then I wanted a separation between the word her and dead. And then I had a line break after highway and she.
That's great. And I appreciate that you noticed that little twist at the end. That's an important part of this particular passage. Thank you, Peg. Does anybody else want to talk about the process that you use to make those decisions? How did you go about? Terry, you just unmuted. Would you like to tell us?
Yes, I'll tell you. Mine, I wrote a lady. I gave it a title. And then I wanted them to know that she's a lady, clear up to the end. But I read it, but I still really didn't read it, I guess, the same as the other one until the very end. And then I go, the old lady, comma, a lady, wow. And I moved it in, I indented, white cotton gloves with hers settled comfortably, a space, the next stanza, the grandmother, a lady. I kept repeating.
Right.
So we could see a navy blue straw sailor hat, a bunch of white violets on the brim, navy blue dress with small white dots in the print, white organdy trimmed with lace collars and cuffs. Then I brought it back, a new stanza, still a lady, purple spray of cloth violets, sachet at her neckline. And then another stanza, anyone would know, a lady. But I didn't know what to do with the children's mother. So I put her all the way over, kind of down in the corner. So I went for, because that's,
So there's a contrast there. You're picking up on the contrast. And
then I redid it again.
Yeah.
I did it again, but with the accident.
Right. There you go. All
So
right.
I don't know, but it's really good, interesting. But I wanted to have her lady all the way through because that was important.
That is important, and that's fascinating. How about someone else? Does someone else want to tell us how you approached this task? How did you decide where you should put line breaks, how you should arrange this? Anybody else want to talk about your process? And clearly you can admit you didn't read it before beginning, because I think that's okay. That's what we're doing.
All right. Well, I already gave Morgan a spoiler alert on this. So my name is Dee Soter, and I'm the elementary literacy specialist at the department. And I think like a first grader, and I read it out loud to myself. And I made my line breaks based on where I felt there were images that were like where I would have natural pauses and where I would move through this if I was reading it with or reading it to a little person, and where I might have natural pauses there, sometimes for punctuation, sometimes for imagery. So all places where there punctuation was a new line, but also if there was an image, like removing her white cotton gloves, skits that alone. So keeping in mind, I think like first grade.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think we could all benefit sometimes from thinking like a first grader. All right. How about one more? Is there one more person who wants to talk about what strategy did you use? How did you approach this task? Jack?
I'll give it a shot. I was really struck by the colors in the passage. The colors really stood out to me more than anything else. And so I tried beginning each line with a color after the first line. So the first line would begin with the old lady, but then every other line would begin with a color. And there were lots of colors, so it still made a pretty decent passage. And then I did have, as the previous speakers noted, I did I think it's called would I end that with a couplet?
Mm-hmm.
So I would end, I'd have a little space at the end and then end with that zinger.
Yeah, and with the zinger ending as a couplet. That's a great strategy. All right.
Thank you.
I appreciate the attention to color. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. So the color thing is really quite significant. All right, I am going to can do this again. There we go. All right. So this was a warm up. This was a way to get you thinking about that relationship between prose and poetry. And I felt very confident that you, all being educators, you were familiar enough with poetry that you would be able to transform prose into verse without too much instruction. But so I'm calling this approach this year during National Poetry Month, Normalized Poetry. And the question is, why do we want to normalize poetry? Well, we've been talking a lot about getting back to normal, about what's the next normal, what's the new normal. And I think we need to pause for just a moment and look at the definition of normal. Normal is usual, typical, expected. That's what I mean by normalizing poetry. Make it a typical instructional tool in your classroom. Have it very usual. Students know when they're looking at a poem that it's a great warm-up exercise, or it's related to what's going on. Because poetry in our classrooms, it's very often taught as a standalone unit. I often hear teachers saying, well, I'll have my poetry unit in March because it's a really long month, and poetry gives us something that we can get to kind of quickly. There's often in the poetry units a focus on the literary terms, the rhyming couplets, the sonnet, the haiku, those literary terms that we want students to learn. Then we often have students write by applying those terms. We have them write some rhyming couplets. We have them write a haiku. We often use poems, I have found, to study a particular period of time. So we'll look at poets of a time period, especially in a geographic location. Or we'll include poetry in a unit when it has a thematic relationship. So we're teaching a story, or we're teaching a unit that's about death and dying. So we have these poems about grief, or we have poems as all of a sudden I have forgotten the word, a eulogy. Thank you. But I think if we limit the teaching of poetry to those particular frames, that we have really missed some important opportunities. Including poetry in every single unit of study provides many opportunities to address learning needs. Well, here's the thing. What is it that we need to address and improve? We know that student achievement levels can be lacking in reading, writing, and speaking. We have data, and we also have experience. Now, I'm going to let you in on a not secret, okay? You got to picture this. This is like the worst kept secret. It's this thing called, and I'm going to say it out loud, and then tell you that it's banned from my vocabulary after that. But it's about learning loss. There's a lot in the news right now about learning loss because of the events of the last year. But my colleagues across the country and I have decided that we are banning that particular expression from our vocabulary. Instead, we're calling it accelerating learning, right? We want to accelerate literacy learning. And it doesn't necessarily have to be specifically related to the events of the last year. We know that we always have students who are reading and writing and speaking below grade level. So what we're trying to do here is two things. We want to build strength and we want to build stamina. In this session, I'm going to address strength building. Building stamina, I'll do in another session later, well after the break. Right? We'll talk about what it means to build stamina. But today it's all about building strength. And the idea behind building strength of literacy is that no text is too complex. No text is ever too complex for any student, because we're going to build that strength and give them what they need to be able to engage with that particular text. So the next thing we're going to do is a waterfall protocol. And I'm pretty sure if you've been living in Zoom land, you've done this. You've tried this already. It's a great strategy in this Zoom function. So the idea is you have some think time. You jot down your ideas in the chat box, but you don't hit send. We'll hit send all at once. All those ideas will come all at one time. So you have to remember to write down your ideas, but don't send them, okay? And I'm telling you, I'm usually the one that messes up on that one. So the question is, what makes this text complex? I'm going to read it out loud for you and then give you a little think time. You asked us, why do we love junk food? A lot of money, strategy, and effort go into designing junk food. The goal was to make it cheap, convenient, and, despite having little to no nutritional value, to keep you wanting more. It's typically high in things like salt, sugar, and fat, which trigger pleasure centers in our brains, making us feel oh so yummy good and encouraging us to keep eating. Okay, where are the complexities in this particular text? What makes this text complex? Remember, don't write yet. Okay, you should have your ideas in the chat box, and I'm going to count down to when you hit send. 3, 2, 1. Okay, long sentences, lack of context, second person point of view, sentence structures, a lot of information in short phrases, some expectation of vocabulary and prior knowledge. Yep, specific vocabulary. Great, those are all great ideas. So I'm going to show you another passage, and I'm going to ask you to do the same protocol. We're going to try the Waterfall Protocol again a second time. And again, I will read the passage out loud to you first and then give you some think time to jot down what makes this passage complex. Whoops, sorry. You asked us a question. Why do we love junk food? A lot of money goes into making junk food. A lot of strategy goes into making junk food good too. Effort also is a big part of making junk food. The goal is to make it cheap. It needs to be easy. And even though it has little to no nutritional value, it keeps you wanting more. It is often high in things like salt and sugar. It also has a lot of fat. They start pleasure centers in our brains. Those make us feel oh so yummy good, and they make us want to keep eating. Okay, so in the chat box, but don't hit send yet, what makes this text complex? Okay, I'm going to count down again, and you can post your ideas. 3, 2, 1. So there's similar needs here in common knowledge. This one is looking, what makes it complex maybe is the content. So this was a bit of a challenge because it's the same passage written 2 different ways, right? And I'm trying to figure out whether you notice the same things that I noticed. So a big question is, how complex are these 2 texts? If somebody asks you, you know, how complex is the text? How do you respond? What kind of language do you use to identify the complexity of a text? Go ahead and put that in the chat box. If you have a way of describing or identifying complex text, how do you do that? So I'm looking for some way that you would identify, like, oh, is this text right for 8th graders or 12th graders? It's like, no, that's not right. It's this kind of text. So this is probably the hardest question that you'll be asked today. And I see Terry says Lexile score. Lexile is definitely one of the ways that we express the complexity of a text. Okay, I think that you're still struggling with this idea of how we express the complexity of a text. So I'm going to move on and see if I can give you some more ideas here. Excuse me just a minute, I've got to change. I have too many screens going. Okay. I want you to think about the factors of complexity, and many of them you've already mentioned. First of all, there's the length of the sentence. How many words are there in the sentences, or what is the average sentence length across the whole passage? Then there's punctuation, the amount and variety of punctuation. Is it all the same? Is it very different? Is there a lot of it? Is there a little of it? There's vocabulary. We're going to talk a lot about vocabulary, the way that we consider vocabulary complexities. Allusion, is it relating to other texts? Is it relating to other things? This is what some of you were talking about, I think, with the need for prior knowledge. This goes along too with imagery and figurative language. If there's a lot of imagery, if there's a lot of figurative language, that can make it very dense for a student to unpack and understand. And what about the topic? Is the topic something that the reader already knows about and therefore it's not as complex, or is it something brand new? Is this introducing a topic to the reader for the first time? There's also content. You know, is the content formed in such a way that it's very dense? Think about reading a short story versus reading a manual. The content can be very complex in the way that it's structured. And of course, there's always context. Is the reader experiencing this in the context of a larger learning experience, or is this completely on its own? Is this something that's taken out and shown in its own part? So I want to talk about quantitative complexity. So the quantitative complexity, when we talk about how complex is this text, one way of expressing that is looking at something that can be expressed with a number, the quantitative complexity. It's often measured with a computer. We've gotten very, very good at calculating a number related to complexity with a computer. And this provides an objective beginning to an objective beginning, if you will, to the question of complexity. So what I'd like to do is to launch a poll. I'm going to ask you which of the following factors of complexity are quantitative elements, okay? And you should be able to click all that apply if I did this correctly. Which of these factors of complexity are quantitative elements? Hopefully you're all seeing the, seeing it up there. A few more people, maybe a couple more need to weigh in. So clearly, number of words in a sentence, yes, absolutely. Punctuation and vocabulary. These are the ones that actually pertain to the quantitative measures. So let's take a look at specifically what makes this text complex First of all, looking at quantitative measures. So you'll notice that in the very first sentence, we have some punctuation, right? There's punctuation in here that is correct. And this particular punctuation, the way that it's formed in here, that is a contributing factor of what makes this complex. Here's what we have. I'm going to call this internal punctuation. You know, you have the end marks of your sentence, and then there's this internal punctuation. This is a longer sentence, and it has only one internal punctuation event. But this one is a really nice long sentence, and it has not only more internal punctuation, but it has rare punctuation, the em dash. How many of you are familiar?
Morgan, are you presenting? Because I'm not seeing anything.
Really?
Yeah. I was like, what sentence am I looking at, Maury?
All right, hold on.
We see each other, but not the sentences.
You're not seeing the sentences highlighted?
We don't see you presenting at all.
Oh,
We just saw the poll.
okay. Oh, the poll, I think, is what knocked us right out. That's why, when I launched the poll. All right, how about now?
Yes.
All right, there we go. So now you're looking at a sentence with some highlights?
Yes.
Oh, phew. Okay, sorry. I didn't realize the poll would stop my share. Okay, so back again. So you look at this first sentence and you see this, there's significant punctuation in there, right? These are some of the flags that would indicate that this is more complex than not. All right, so here's a long sentence with only one internal punctuation event, but here's a sentence, right? It has 4 internal punctuation events, and 2 of them are rare. The em dash and the n dash, you know, those different types of dashes. Now, this is important because a lot of students, especially students reading below grade level, are not going to be entirely certain what to do with these dashes, right? The dashes for some students could be a full stop or it could be a skip over. And so the dashes also, and because dashes are rarely used, they're going to represent a higher rate of complexity. Now we have a nice long sentence, 3 commas as internal punctuation, and oh yes, look at this, hyphens. This gives us an opportunity to talk about the difference between a dash and a hyphen, right? So this is great. In just this little short itty bit of a passage, there's lots of things to talk about for the quantitative, the objective and reliable forms of complexity that may need a little bit of targeted instruction. Okay, now here's the other version. And what I want you to note is that in this other version, the internal punctuation is removed. So let's go back for just a moment. In this one, we have 4 sentences. What is the average length of those 4 sentences? What do you think? What would be the average length of these 4 sentences? Can anybody estimate?
Which are we looking at? The first one or the second one?
This first one, hopefully you're looking at the one, right, that has commas, right?
Okay.
I bet average might be about 15.
Okay.
Just taking a guess.
So 15 to 17 is an average. Now we're going to look at the other one. This one, right, with all of the periods at the end, no commas. This has, I think it's 11 sentences. What's the average length of the sentence in this version?
maybe seven
Well,
word.
So it's definitely closer to 6 or 7 at most. Much, much shorter sentences. More sentences, shorter sentences. So there's this question about what you lose. This is the same passage written 2 different ways. And one way it has longer sentences that can be harder to grasp. The other way has really short sentences. But there's actually less there. So I want to think about when we're looking at the complexity of our text. What are we talking about, right? What's a problem that we need to be addressing? There's 3 things. There's the reading level, there's the instructional level, and there's frustration level. So the reading level can apply to either the student or the text. And when we talk about reading level, this is where you come in, like when you say the Lexile score, well, that's the complexity level, the reading level of the text. But then we have a Lexile score that we assign to students. And that indicates what students can comfortably read on their own and understand to about 75% of the text. So it's not 100% comprehension, but it's mostly comprehension. So we talk about reading level, it's the reading level of the text and the reading level of the student. This is important to know because it indicates what students can do independently. Matching students to text is one way literacy growth can be limited. And I'll tell you, one of my favorite literacy researchers, Tim Shanahan, has written quite a bit on the need to make sure that students are supported to read grade level text, that we're not simply matching students to text, that we're using that knowledge of the reading level of the text and the reading level of the student to indicate where instruction needs to be targeted. Not matching students, but matching instructional strategies. And that brings us to the instructional level of the text. This is where we should apply our knowledge of the reading level, both for the student and the text. The instructional level, Sue Pimentel calls these juicy sentences. The instructional level, it's the parts of the text that we really want to focus on for either whole class reads or for that direct instruction. We're looking for the really juicy parts of the text, the more complex parts. This is actually where we build strength. I want to talk just a little bit about frustration level, because I think people fear frustration level. But the reality is, if we provide students with the tools they need to unlock complex text, then a little bit of frustration is great. It's a challenge, right? We always want to be providing them support for reaching for the next level. And so we don't want them to be frustrated and give up. We want them to get to that level of frustration where they want to solve the problem. So here's the most important thing to think about. Students who never engage with complex texts will not grow as readers, writers, and critical thinkers. I want you to consider the 2 versions of the text about junk food. These are both from Smithsonian Tween Tribune. And if you go into Smithsonian Tween Tribune, you can find fabulous articles. Smithsonian is a great resource. And you can choose the Lexile score. You read excerpts from one version of the article that Lexile's at 1430. So that's high school level. The other version was 560, that's elementary level. The difference between those 2 articles is 1430 to 560 on a Lexile range. So the quantitative measure of these 2 articles is vastly different. Think about if a student had a steady diet of the 560 because they were reading below grade level, they'd be living on a steady diet of junk food reading. How's that for a nice little tie-in of an analogy? So I'd like you to think about what you find frustrating when teaching reading and writing in your classroom? What are some things that you have tried to address the things that frustrate you? How about if you just pop them into the chat box at this moment? We'll take a moment to think about it. What is something that really frustrates you when you're teaching reading and writing? I'm going to be quiet for a minute and give you think time. Okay, you're thinking about something that is persistently frustrating when you're teaching reading, writing. So Natalie, you're talking about underestimating the amount of background knowledge, and that can be wildly frustrating. And I know, students don't understand that a lot of things are tied into teaching literacy. They expect us to put up those firm dividers between the different content areas, but they all need to be overlapping for sure. Terry, the individual needs more one-on-one than you can give them. Yeah, absolutely, because too many need it. Reading out loud, that is really intimidating, and yet it can be really helpful. And the thinking, expecting everything to be fed to them. Time. I see this time, the lack of vocabulary, the lack of time to teach that. Certainly grammar knowledge. It's amazing how grammar knowledge can make all the difference in the world, and yet it's really, really hard to teach that. Keeping up the rigor and not losing the stamina. That's a hard one. Yeah, that's definitely. So these are all, one of the reasons I wanted you to share your persistent frustrations is to know that you're not alone. These tend to be pretty typical. And so we're going to keep looking at ways to address those. So, I hear you, Margot, trying to teach when they really just need to practice. So that's the difference between strength and stamina, and trying to find the balance of both. So let's look at a few more things that we can do. One of the things may be, I showed you two vastly different levels of complexity in the Tween Tribune. You can also, as you probably know, Newsella, I don't know how you want to pronounce it. It also offers you the opportunity to look up an article and present it and access it at different levels. So my suggestion would be have all of your students start with the very lowest level that you can find. They go down often into the 400s, super, super, super simple. And then work with the students to read that article and look at the relationship of information. You'll notice between the highest level and the lowest level, the words that help the students map the relationship of information are missing when they're chopped into short sentences. It actually reads like computer speak. And oftentimes I think that's what happens is a computer just cuts it right down to the minimal. Have the students rewrite these short articles by combining sentences using really specific punctuation or conjunctions. Like if you're working on having the students use colons or semicolons, or you're looking for parentheticals, if there's something that you want to teach that will help them to access the article, the book, the novel, the task that you're assigning to them, look for this opportunity to teach this kind of punctuation when they're combining sentences. You can also have a word wall of subordinating and coordinating conjunctions. That is the most fantastic, spectacular word wall that you could have. I've seen high school classrooms that have these word walls of subordinating and coordinating conjunctions because it's a reminder of the ways that ideas are put together. And then you can check for understanding. After you have the students combine, rewrite, combining the sentences from simple to complex, then go and look at the most complex version of that article, which is undoubtedly the way it was originally written, right? So look at how the students come out compared to the way that the author originally wrote it, that highest complexity. Natalie, I agree. We keep thinking about how we break it down, how we go from complex down to simple. But the students need some background knowledge. They need some practice. And if we start with the most simple computer speak, they'll see it, they'll access it, and they'll feel more confident. Several of you mentioned your frustration is with that internal motivation. If they see something simple and you're asking them to make it more complex, you're giving them these tools, you're saying, okay, here's the connectors. How can you put this together? I'm giving you something that has 12 sentences. Can you make it 4 sentences and still make sense, right? It's like all the words are there. Here's the tools. Here are the connecting pieces, right? And that way they're understanding some of those complexities when they see them. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that this quantitative complexity, this quantitative analysis, is the shortest route to what we might want to map for instruction, right? It's an objective analysis. It's a great way to begin, but it's just a beginning, right? It's just a jumping off point. So let's talk about what you did for homework. I gave you 4 really juicy sentences, 4 really complex sentences. And we often find these in literature. So here's how it started out. And this is where I get to tell you, this was actually, I just have to move some stuff here. This is actually an excerpt from Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. How many of you know that story? Right? It's a fantastic story. And this particular style of writing is typical of your Southern Renaissance writers like Robert Penn Warren or William Faulkner, where they write these incredibly descriptive sentences that can go on and on and on and on. And my students, we were reading All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, and my students claimed that the guy just wrote nothing but run-on sentences. It's all just a big run-on sentence. And so I had them break it down, and I challenged them to write what they found to be the most complex, the longest run-on sentence, and write it in verse form. And what they found, of course, was, well, no, it's actually not a run-on sentence. It's just a super complex sentence. So this is something similar to what we have here. Flannery O'Connor is another one of those Southern writers of the time period. And of course, Flannery O'Connor, if you're a fan, she's also known for putting in these really wicked twists. So the first thing you'll notice is that these are long sentences, and they don't necessarily have a lot of internal punctuation. And so, a little bit of what happens there is it can be more challenging for the student to hang on to the ideas and to see the relationships all the way through. But then you'll notice there's also some cues going on in here. So students who've been taught during their writing lessons to make sure that they maintain the verb tense, that is something that we hammer on when we give them feedback on their writing. Your verb tense needs to remain the same. Well, they look at the first sentence and they see the old lady settled, and then she's removing and putting. And so your sentences are going to want to claim this is a mistake. So there is an opportunity for us to teach something about using verb tenses for the effect for the storytelling. But then you'll notice in the next sentence, which is wonderfully long and detailed, that there's this little bit, and someone had mentioned not really sure what to do about the mother. Well, there's two words in here, or one word used a couple of times. The children's mother still had on stacks, still had her head tied up. So highlighting just those two words, still and still, that shows a great contrast with what else happens in the sentence. But, right? But. One of those conjunctions that indicates a contradiction. There's a contrast. So if we just had the students look at the way this sentence is organized with a great big B-U-T right there, the mother and the grandmother. The grandmother's, the mother still had on slacks, still had her head tied in a kerchief, but the grandmother had on a fancy dress and gloves and a hat. Lots and lots of detail. And then of course we get down to the bottom where you get that sudden turn in case of an accident. This is that introductory clause that presents yet another contradiction. This one is more contradiction in tone, contradiction in plot. And here's another thing. The vocabulary in this short section is really worth a second look. Now, I'd like to take your attention to the words purse and spray. If you ask students to identify words they don't know, they probably wouldn't say purse or spray. Chances are they may have heard of those. Certainly, children know what spray is. You know, your students are going to recognize spray. But this is a very different and unusual use of the word spray. And purse, well, you know, you can purse your lips, you can carry a purse. There's different ways of using that word. Slacks, kerchief, sachet, these are words that are very timely. So when a text complexity level is evaluated with a computer, they look at vocabulary. It's not a question of what your students would know. It's not a question of necessarily your student's background. You're looking at how often will a student likely encounter these words in the reading that they would typically do at their level. Right? How often do these words typically appear in words that are written at that level of complexity at their grade span? And so these words here, purse, slacks, kerchief, organy, spray, and sachet, these are the kinds of words that are going to elevate the complexity of the text. What do you think you should do with slacks, kerchief, organdy, and sachet? These are very unusual words. These are very specific to this story, to this time period, to this context. Tim Shanahan says, tell them. Just tell them what these words mean. Those really tough words, Ruth.
Lots of times when my sixth graders, I'll give them a visual too.
Mm-hmm.
just explaining it to them. It's better to show them a visual and then they're like, oh, okay, I understand.
I'm sure you could find a picture of a very proper Southern grandma from the 1930s or 40s. Absolutely. But then you take a word like spray. Spray has so many different meanings. Spray, I have to tell you, that would be an SAT word. This is an excellent example of an SAT word. When the SAT updated in 2016, one of the things that they did is they completely changed the way they address vocabulary. So we need to know whether students can recognize vocabulary in context. So you think about this, spray. Spray can have several different meanings. When we talk about choosing the meaning in context, we mean the students can look at 4 completely accurate definitions of spray. They have to choose the one that correlates to this use. That's what it means to determine and define a word in context. So when you're looking at vocabulary within a complex text, look for words that students are going to think they know, but are used in such an unusual way that they actually have to stop and determine the context to pick the right meaning, right? And even if students are reading digitally and can pull up a whole bunch of different meanings, they may not get the right one. So here's how I created my poem from Flannery O'Connor. I did, like a lot of you did, just started breaking it. For me, I was looking at these verbs, right? And then the descriptive phrases. And then I did like you. I really wanted to emphasize Flannery O'Connor's twist at the end, because she does it with every story. And the thing I have to tell you, this little sentence right here, this little twist at the end of this particular passage, it actually foreshadows the end of the story. So let's talk again about opportunities missed and opportunities taken. So just out of curiosity, in the chat box, can you describe this object? Just describe this object. Go ahead, just a phrase, a few words. How would you describe this object? Red, octagon, white letters. Oops, sorry. Stop, red. Oh, Margot went in a totally different way. All right, well, let's try this. Now try it without using these words. Red, white, stop, sign, and octagon. Can you describe this object again without using these words? Red, white, stop sign, octagon. I will tell you, when I've used this strategy with my students, there's always someone who wants to use blood and snow as an image to describe the colors. Halt usually comes in. So this is a strategy called the taboo poem. You ask the students to describe a common object and then take out like the 5 most common words or phrases and have them replace those. They describe again. This encourages them to maybe use a thesaurus. This also helps them to consider the use of images or allusions in the writing that they're reading or doing. Taboo poems are really fun. I just want to warn you though, if you're going to do this in the classroom and you're not defining the objects that you're challenging them to describe, you're looking for the really common objects that they feel comfortable with, you are going to get several descriptions of toilets. It always happens. So let's think about mentor texts. Mentor texts are those texts that you can read repeatedly. They just have so much in them. There's so much about them that you just want to go back and read them again and again. In this particular case, poems that inspire rearranging long sentences or conflict, these make great mentor texts, especially if you're going to have students reading novels that are more complex than others or longer passages. I'm really sorry. Let me just let them know. There we go. Sorry. So let's look at, as a mentor text, this particular poem. This is from, I think you all probably got A New Land or somewhere they went out. This is the poems that were written by youth in the telling room. So here's, there we go. This is the first stanza of this particular poem. What do you notice about this stanza, this first part of this poem? What stands out to you about this stanza? Yeah, the colors again, definitely. So the first part of this, you know, we're looking at really setting the tone of the poem with these vibrant color. Right, and the effect of the colors, the bright colors on the gray room. So then we're looking at, in the next part, there's a little more action, right? So now the speaker is describing the woman looking at the wall, but she's not looking. She's looking at a conflicting frame. What is a conflicting frame? It's a family portrait, and do you like the family I chose to represent here? So here's where we have the use of very specific words, right? You think about the taboo poem, and you could have it doing, like walking to the cafeteria. Okay, we're not going to use the word walking. What else might we, how many other ways can we describe this? You can have, as another word wall, you can have common words: walking, running, jumping, eating, right? And then have a family of words that show all these different shades of meaning, glimpsing at the art rather than staring or examining or looking at. She halts her step, halt instead of stop, right? What is ambling? Why does ambling refer or infer something different? So here we have a contradiction once again, right? She's observing the smiling faces trapped in the photograph, trapped. And it suddenly turns very dark. clearly this student is, this youth writer is working through some angst. Think about how you can use the short passages in the poems to get the students ready to engage with a very complex prose. Here's another one. Now, this is a passage from To Kill a Mockingbird. What you need to know about To Kill a Mockingbird is that if you look at the Lexile score for the entire book, the average of the entire novel places the Lexile level at like a 4th grade level. But there are parts of the novel that are far more complex. Parts, and you have to know where they are. The parts that are far more complex are the parts where we want to get the students ready for engaging with that much more complex text. Here's what's happening in this particular part. This passage is more complex because it represents the voice of the adult scout, the adult narrator. The parts of To Kill a Mockingbird that are far more complex are the ones that focus on the adult conversation, the courtroom, the aunt who comes to visit, the adults talking. You'll notice that it's far more complex because there's a whole lot more punctuation. It's varied and extensive. There are colons and semicolons, and by the way, in the Common Core state standards, colons and semicolons are at 8th grade level. So when you find those parts of this text that have those very complex kinds of sentence construction, that's where we need to do the close reading, the direct instruction. The vocabulary in this section is also complex. Some of it is definitely contextual. Shotgun haul, varmints and slop jars, and the icebox. These are not things that students need to write down, look up, use in a sentence, demonstrate. They don't need to hang on to these because these are rarefied, right? So these are things that we can provide them. These are things we can tell them about. But then looking at supplemented industry or industries, that the fruits of their industry, these are the kinds of things that we can hang on to and work with students to understand and lock into their brains. And there's also much longer sentences in this section. Much of the text is written in dialogue, and a lot of the dialogue is between children. So it's very short segments with little description. And so those are the parts that students should be able to read on their own, right? But if you've practiced helping students look at the really long parts, looking at the verse form versus the poetic form, you might have something that looks a little bit more like this. We ask the students to start unpacking the really complex part by looking at that verse form. Once they understand that poems tend to isolate images that are arranged on the page to bring you to a certain kind of interpretation or understanding. This is a part where they're describing the Ewell household. I love this part. It's all poetic prose, and that's actually one of the characteristics of these Southern Renaissance writers. So let's think about accessing complex texts. We start with a quantitative, and starting with the quantitative is an objective part, an objective strategy. Then we start moving into that qualitative analysis. What are the parts that represent maturity? And then you think about what you want students to do as a result of close reading. And here's why it really pays off. You want to think about common expectations in a writing rubric. Many of our writing rubrics state that students are using varied sentence structures. But if they don't know what varied sentence structures are, they're not going to do that. So if your writing rubric states that students will use varied sentence structures, Well, now you've got some ways to really point them to specific uses. I want you to use subordinate, I want you to use coordinating conjunctions, I want you to use at least 2 semicolons where you can see that the ideas are so closely related that even though they're independent clauses, they can be connected, right? Oh, it says practice sentient combining. I'm so sorry, that should say practice sentence combining. I'll fix that. We also, oftentimes in our writing rubrics, we write that students use vivid descriptive language, right? But they need some practice for how to do that to get beyond the mundane and the trite and the tired. And then oftentimes we try to express in our rubric the fact that students write, they use a sophisticated expression of ideas, but they don't often know what it is. And to tell you the truth, sometimes we can have a little bit of trouble expressing what that is. So what we're looking for is the students will demonstrate development of the craft, and believe it or not, by close reading and studying poetry and the craft of the poet in these little bits, we get over to these writing rubrics where the prose that they're writing gets better because of the study. So close reading makes students better readers, better writers, and better speakers, right? They're going to develop that confidence and they're going to be better speakers. So that's it. That's my argument for studying poetry regularly. Phew. All right. Felt like I kind of tore through that. So what do you think? How, are you, what questions do you have about really digging into complexity and drawing that parallel between poetry and prose to unlock complexity? And by the way, we're not calling it learning loss. We're calling it learning acceleration. Remember that one. So I'm going to be honest, these are some of my favorite strategies. So clearly I have a bias, right?
Morgan, I have a question.
Sure.
I see a lot of value in going back and forth between, from poetry to prose and vice versa. And I'm wondering how I would use it. For instance, would I take a complex prose text and then ask students to rewrite it as poetry?
Write it.
Or would I take,
Yep.
right, in verse form? Or would I take a complex poem and have students write that in prose? Can you speak to that a little bit?
So
as to different ways that you could use that?
So the first thing that we need to make sure students know is those elements of poetry, the elements of the verse form that provide us lots of opportunities to teach. One of the questions that I've been getting regularly is about teaching grammar and mechanics, and we do not want to go back to the old Warners. We don't want to do those sort of dry exercises, but if you use poetry to really pay attention to the mechanics and the grammar, the word usage, those things that are in the language standards, first of all, to get students familiar with them. So you want to use the poetry to get students familiar. And I know a lot of us use warm-up exercises when students first come in, when you are taking attendance. So if you're actually using a poem or a part of a poem to have students analyze text or respond to it when you're looking at what makes this, what you're asking those questions that relate to the prose that they're eventually going to have to unlock, then you're providing that opportunity to practice the skill. I find success then in taking the complex text and writing it in verse form. Once they understand, those elements of verse form and how the poet. So it's interesting because I find a lot of teachers teach a poetry unit in the spring. And I think actually teaching a poetry unit right off the bat, beginning of the school year, would be really helpful. It gives you a chance to teach some of those essential elements. And then constantly revisiting it as you teach the more and more complex texts. And, getting to that, I had students, I had very strong readers studying All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. And they were just really struggling to get through because they're trying to hold on to ideas on sentences that were a whole page long. So I challenged them in this one really tough chapter to pick a spot that was especially dense and write it in verse form. What do you see if you look at this prose as a poem? What do you notice? And they once they did that, they found, first of all, almost all of them chose the same place in the chapter, which was really interesting. And it was because it was so visual and it was so detailed. And we started looking at the way that they unpacked it and turned it into verse. And that helped them actually. We spent a whole 80-minute class period on just that exercise and getting to understand what it was really saying and why it was written that way. And it helped them then. They took off and were reading much better after that. So I hopefully I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
When I did the exercise that you gave us in the beginning, went like a different way, and I didn't realize we were supposed to just take the literal language that was there and not change it, and just change like how it was appearing on the page. So I just wrote like something totally different. And I wonder, like, that's more like the taboo poem exercise that you talked about. So I guess my question is just like, what situations do you find that you could give those different assignments in? Like, one assignment is specifically telling the students, don't change the words, just change how they appear on the page. And another assignment might be, you can change it to be as creative as you want. I don't know, like, which one you've had more success with, or which one is good for teaching different things.
Both, and it's context. So I think the idea of taking some really complex sentences and writing them in verse form is a way to help students unlock the complex text they're reading. Having students write the taboo poems, and think about that, is if the complexity of the text they're reading has a lot to do with imagery or unusual words, it can help there. But the other way that it's helpful is if the related assignment is about writing. And so now you're getting the students, you're really getting the juices flowing about how they describe something. I'm not talking about a red and white stop sign. I'm talking about, blood on snow, screaming halt. I'm thinking of different ways of stating the same thing. And so that's really helpful as we near a writing exercise.
Good, thank you. I think I'm going to use that, keeping the words the same, but just writing it in verse form for the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, because that has some really long, confusing, old style sentences in it.
And I find there are some writers who really, if you start reading it aloud, you find the poetic prose. I'll take something that's really complex and read it aloud, hoping that the students can hear the cadence, they hear the rhythm that some of our best prose writers really do have a strong rhythm in the way they're writing. And I think Frederick Douglass is one of them.
Thanks.
The next thing that I'm planning is looking at the companion maybe to the strategy about building stamina. You know, we want students to be able to read independently, but we also, you know, it should be accessing, challenging themselves more and more, reading more complex texts. So this is all about really providing that direct instruction. And I think especially this year where we maybe have less face-to-face time, looking for those opportunities to teach. And this can be done, a lot of these strategies can be done whole class, where the students build some confidence, and they really increase their tools for engaging with the complex text, can get them ready. So part of it is just knowing what makes your text complex. Most novels, you know, you get a novel with a certain Lexile score or one of the other tools that you use, excuse me, and it's an average. So the chances are it's uneven. You're going to find places that might be a little bit of a hurdle, a little bit of a bump. And that's when getting students ready to engage with more complex can be really, text can be really helpful. Anybody teach a verse novel? Yeah, they see that's
Yeah.
really fun. Do you? What verse novel do you teach, Meg?
Let's see, I've done Brown Girl Dreaming. I'm trying to figure out right now what to do with other words for home. Some of the Kwame Alexander ones.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, those are all great. My favorite, of course, is The Good Braider, because it's set in Portland. It's a main story, really.
What's the title?
The Good Braider.
The Good Braider.
Yeah, yeah. It's about a refugee student who comes to Portland High School and tries to understand some of these cultural differences. I'm hoping it's in verse form. So
I also just started a book club, April book club, and one of the titles I'm using is Ordinary Hazards by Nikki Grimes. It's a novel in verse memoir, very powerful.
wow.
Definitely upper level in terms of language and content for 7th graders, but I send it home with a parent letter. Morgan, I just tried to access the certificate link for the feedback and certificate, and I got a message saying,
Oh,
you can't sign in here. I've tried my school email and my personal email,
sorry.
and I don't know what's happening. Yeah, I'm being halted.
Yeah. Oh, I totally forgot. There's a setting I have to change, and I forgot.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Let me just get a minute here. Well, folks, I'm really glad that you hung in here today. I'm going to stop the recording here.